The mud beneath Commander Jake Sullivan's belly had turned cold hours ago, seeping through his tactical vest and chilling him to the bone. His finger hovered millimeters from the trigger of his HK-416, eye pressed against the scope as he watched the compound through the green-tinted darkness. 3 tangos patrolled the perimeter, their AK-47s slung casually across their shoulders, cigarette embers glowing like fireflies in the Afghan night. If you're enjoying this intense military thriller, please like this video and subscribe for more gripping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Then he heard them. Footsteps, light, deliberate, moving through the rocky terrain behind his position with the kind of precision that made his blood run cold. His team was spread across a half-mile radius, each man locked in his own silent vigil. These weren't his boots crushing the scattered stones. Jake's breathing slowed to nearly nothing, a technique drilled into him through 16 years of special operations. His left hand found the radio clipped to his chest, thumb hovering over the transmission button. The footsteps grew closer, definitely human, definitely tactical in their spacing and rhythm. His mind raced through possibilities. Taliban patrol? Local militia? Civilians who'd stumbled into a kill zone? The footsteps stopped 20 meters behind him. Silence stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the distant murmur of voices from the compound and the soft whistle of mountain wind through the rocks. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat thunderous in his ears. 16 years of missions, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the deserts of Iraq, from the jungles of South America to classified operations in Eastern Europe, and he'd never felt this kind of electric tension crawling up his spine. Then came the voice. Soft as a prayer, clear as crystal, spoken in perfect English with an accent he couldn't place, somewhere between Southern American and something else. Something that reminded him of home but felt impossibly foreign. Friendlies approaching. The words hit him like a physical blow. Jake's entire body went rigid. No one knew they were here. This was a black operation, compartmentalized to the point where even his own command structure operated on a need-to-know basis. The compound below housed a high-value target suspected of coordinating attacks against NATO forces, and Jake's team had been inserted via night drop 36 hours ago. They'd been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to execute. But that voice, that impossible gentle voice that had somehow found him in the darkness of the Afghan mountains. Don't turn around, Commander Sullivan. The voice came again, closer now, maybe 10 meters. Keep your weapon trained on the compound. Your mission parameters haven't changed. Jake's blood turned to ice water. She knew his name. She knew his rank. She knew exactly what he was doing here, in a place where no friendly forces were supposed to exist within 100 miles. His thumb pressed against the radio button. Overwatch, this is Phantom 6, he whispered into his throat mic, using the brevity code they'd established for emergencies. Request immediate status check on all positioned assets. Static filled his earpiece for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then came the familiar voice of Petty Officer Martinez, positioned on the eastern ridge. Phantom 6, Watcher East. In position, no movement, no contact. Watcher South, in position and clear, came Petty Officer Kim's voice from the southern. Approach, Watcher North, static and quiet, reported Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez from the northern Overwatch. One by one, his team checked in. All accounted for, all in position, all reporting no unusual activity. Yet someone was standing in the darkness behind him, someone who knew things she had no right to know. Jake's mind raced through his training. Compromise protocols demanded immediate extraction. But the voice had said friendlies. The voice had told him to maintain his position. The voice belonged to someone who clearly had intelligence about his mission that went beyond anything in his operational briefing. Who are you? He whispered, not into his radio but into the night air, hoping the wind would carry his words to whoever stood in the shadows behind him. A soft laugh drifted through the darkness, musical and warm despite the circumstances. Someone who's been watching over you longer than you know. Jake, someone who knows that in approximately 4 minutes, a 5th patrol is going to round the northeast corner of that compound. Someone who knows that your current extraction plan is going to put your team directly into an ambush that would cost lives. Jake's scope swung toward the northeast corner of the compound. Empty, dark, nothing moved in the shadows of the building. That intel had designated as a weapons cache. But something in the voice made him believe her, made him trust her in a way that defied every protocol he'd ever learned. Impossible, he breathed. Our intel was triple verified. Satellite surveillance, human assets, electronic intercepts. There's no 5th patrol. Your intelligence is 3 days old, the voice replied, and now he could hear her moving, circling to his left but maintaining that precise distance. The situation changed when a new shipment arrived yesterday afternoon. More weapons, more personnel, more security. Your agency's asset inside went dark yesterday at 1400 hours local time. You weren't informed because the mission was deemed too critical to abort. The words hit Jake like individual bullets. Everything she'd said aligned with the nagging doubts he'd been suppressing since infiltration. The compound had felt different than intelligence suggested, more active, more populated, more dangerous. He'd attributed it to operational paranoia, the natural tendency of experienced operators to expect the worst. But she was right about their asset. Jake had noticed the missed check-in during their final briefing, but command had assured him it was a temporary communication issue. How do you know about our asset? He asked, still staring through his scope at the compound below. Because I've been tracking the same network you're targeting, came the reply. Different agency, different objectives, but the same bad guys. And right now, Jake, those bad guys are about to make your mission significantly more complicated. As if summoned by her words, shadows began moving in the compound below. Jake adjusted his scope, counting figures. 1, 2, 3 new shapes emerging from the main building. Armed, alert, moving with military precision toward the northeast corner, where his planned extraction route would take his team in exactly 12 minutes. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Language, Commander, the voice said, and he could hear the smile in her words. Your mother raised you better than that. The mention of his mother sent a chill deeper than the mountain cold through Jake's body. His mother had died when he was 8, killed in a car accident that had shaped every decision he'd made since. The loss had driven him to join the military, driven him through SEAL training, driven him through years of deployments that had cost him 2 marriages and countless nights of sleep. Nobody talked about his mother. Not his teammates, not his commanders, not the shrinks the Navy made him see after particularly difficult missions. His mother was a closed book, a wound that had never properly healed. How do you, he began, but the voice cut him off. Focus. Jake, the 5th patrol is moving into position. You need to adjust your extraction route. Tell your team to shift to the southern approach, but wait for my signal. There's going to be a distraction in approximately 90 seconds. Jake's training warred with his instincts. Every protocol screamed at him to call for immediate extraction, to get his team out of what was clearly a compromised situation. But something deeper, some intuitive recognition that had saved his life more times than he could count, told him to trust the voice in the darkness. Overwatch, this is Phantom 6, he whispered into his throat mic. Adjust extraction to southern approach on my mark. Hold current positions until further notice. The acknowledgments came back immediately, his team's trust in his judgment absolute and unquestioning. 16 years of successful missions had earned him that trust, but now he was gambling with their lives based on the word of a ghost. Through his scope, Jake watched the compound with new eyes. The patrols moved differently than intelligence had suggested, more coordinated, more professional. These weren't the semi-trained militants his briefing had described. These were soldiers, possibly former military, definitely experienced in small unit tactics. 30 seconds, the voice whispered, and Jake realized she'd moved again. Now she was somewhere to his right, maintaining that perfect distance that kept her invisible while allowing her to monitor both him and the compound, Jake's grip on his weapon tightened. Whatever was about to happen would determine not just the success of this mission, but possibly the survival of his entire team. He thought about Petty Officer Martinez, 23 years old with a new wife back in Virginia Beach, about Chief Rodriguez, who'd been Jake's right hand for 5 years and had 3 daughters he coached in soccer, about Kim, the quiet sniper who sent money home to his immigrant parents every month, all of them depending on Jake's decision to trust a voice in the darkness. 15 seconds, came the whisper. Through the scope, Jake saw one of the original patrols light another cigarette. The small flame illuminated a bearded face, older than intel had suggested, with the kind of scars that spoke of experience in asymmetrical warfare. 10 seconds. Jake's breathing slowed to combat rhythm, his heart rate dropping to the controlled pulse that had carried him through countless operations. Whatever was about to happen, he would be ready. Double quotes, 5.4. The explosion came from the western side of the compound, a brilliant flash of orange and white that lit up the mountain night like a small sun. Not large enough to cause serious damage, but sufficient to send every patrol racing toward the commotion, their discipline momentarily forgotten in the face of what appeared to be a rocket attack. Now, the voice whispered. Southern approach. Move fast but stay low. You have approximately 3 minutes before they realize it was a diversion. Jake keyed his radio. Overwatch, execute Southern extraction now. Move with purpose, maintain noise discipline. As his team began their coordinated withdrawal, Jake remained in position for 30 more seconds, providing overwatch as they'd trained. Through his scope, he watched the compound's defenders rushing toward the western wall where the explosion had originated, their attention completely diverted from the direction his team was taking. Only when Rodriguez's voice crackled through his earpiece with Phantom 6, all assets clear of danger zone, did Jake begin his own withdrawal. He rose from the prone position slowly, muscles cramped from hours of stillness, weapon still ready as he prepared to fade back into the mountain darkness. But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of movement on the ridge above him, a figure, silhouetted against the star-filled sky for just a moment, slender, definitely female, moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged in these mountains. Then she was gone, disappeared into the landscape as if she'd never existed at all. Jake stared at the empty ridge for a long moment, questions burning in his mind like acid. Who was she? How had she known so much about his mission, about his team, about his life? Where had the explosion come from? And how had she coordinated it so perfectly with their extraction needs? Most importantly, why had she helped them? His radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. Phantom 6, we're at Rally Point Alpha, requesting your status. Moving to your position now, Jake replied, taking one last look at the ridge where the mysterious figure had appeared. ETA 2 minutes. As he made his way through the rocky terrain toward the extraction point, Jake's mind churned with possibilities. CIA, NSA, some other agency operating in the same area with overlapping objectives, or something else entirely. Something outside the normal boundaries of military and intelligence operations. The extraction helicopter was already inbound by the time Jake reached Rally Point Alpha, its rotors beating a familiar rhythm that spoke of home and safety. His team was spread in a defensive perimeter, professional and alert despite the questions. He could see in their eyes. They'd all heard his radio calls, knew something unusual had happened, but trusted him enough not to ask questions until they were safely away from hostile territory. As the helicopter settled into its landing zone, Jake took one final look back toward the compound. Lights were still moving around the western wall where the explosion had occurred, but the building itself remained intact. Their target was still inside, still breathing, still coordinating attacks against NATO forces. The mission had been a failure in terms of their primary objective. But his team was alive, uncompromised, and would live to fight another day. Sometimes Jake reflected as he climbed into the helicopter. That was the most important victory of all. But as the aircraft lifted off and banked toward their forward operating base, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this night had changed. Something fundamental about his understanding of the war, about the nature of the forces operating in these mountains, about the thin line between friend and enemy in a conflict where nothing was ever quite what it seemed. The voice echoed in his memory as the helicopter carried them through the dark Afghan sky. Someone who's been watching over you longer than, Jake, watching over him. The phrase implied a level of personal investment that went beyond professional interest, beyond operational necessity. It suggested something deeper, something that made Jake's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Months later, Jake learned the truth. Sarah Michelle Patterson had been his mother's best friend, killed in the same accident, but somehow continuing to exist to fulfill a promise. She'd built a protection network spanning decades, keeping military families safe while gathering evidence on those who threatened them. The Pakistani mission exposed a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of officials who'd marked successful teams for elimination, viewing their achievements as security threats. But Sarah Michelle had turned their trap against them. Jake's team gathered evidence that brought down the conspirators and led to congressional hearings that reformed military oversight. The protection network became the Rebecca Sullivan Memorial Foundation, ensuring future generations of military families would be safe. Standing at his mother's memorial years later, Jake realized the promise made at her grave had grown beyond anything he'd imagined, into a legacy that would protect others long after he was gone. And somehow, in the depths of his soldier's soul, Jake knew he'd be hearing from her again. Debriefing room at forward operating base. Chapman smelled like stale coffee and bureaucratic frustration. Jake sat across from Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Pierce, his battalion commander, and tried to find words for events that defied explanation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Pierce's weathered face as she reviewed his after-action report for the third time. "Let me understand this correctly, Commander Sullivan," Pierce said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who'd heard too many impossible stories from operators returning from the field. An unknown female, speaking perfect English, appeared at your position with detailed intelligence about enemy patrol patterns and coordinated a distraction that facilitated your team's extraction. Jake nodded, knowing how insane it sounded. "Yes, ma'am. And this unknown female knew your name, your rank, and details about your mission that were classified at the highest levels." "Affirmative." Pierce set the report down and rubbed her temples. At 42, she was young for a battalion commander, but the Afghanistan deployment had aged her visibly. Gray streaked her brown hair, and lines mapped the territory around her eyes like defensive positions on a tactical map. "Jake," she said, dropping the formality that usually governed their interactions, "I've known you for 6 years. You're one of the most reliable operators I've ever worked with. You don't hallucinate, you don't embellish, and you sure as hell don't make up ghost stories to explain mission failures." The words stung because they carried truth. Jake had built his reputation on reliability, on being the commander who brought everyone home, on making the hard calls that kept his team alive. But tonight had shaken something fundamental in his worldview. "Ma'am, I know how it sounds, but I've got 3 witnesses who heard my radio calls, who can verify the timeline of events. The explosion that facilitated our extraction wasn't random. Someone with advanced knowledge of our position and our mission parameters coordinated. That distraction. Pierce opened a folder Jake hadn't noticed before. Inside were satellite photographs of the compound, taken at various times throughout the night. She spread them across the table like tarot cards predicting an uncertain future. These photos show the explosion occurred at exactly 0347 hours local time, she said, pointing to an image that captured the bright flash on the compound's western wall. It was caused by what appears to be a single mortar round, fired from a position approximately 800 meters northwest of the target building. Jake studied the photos, his tactical mind automatically calculating angles and trajectories. That's expert marksmanship, he observed. Perfect timing, minimal damage, maximum distraction. The kind of precision that requires not just advanced training, but intimate knowledge of the target and the tactical situation, Pierce agreed. Which brings us back to your mysterious benefactor. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing the mountainous terrain around the compound. Red circles marked the positions where Jake's team had been deployed, drawn with the kind of accuracy that could only come from real-time surveillance. Our intelligence analysis suggests that whoever helped you last night had been observing the area for at least 24 hours, Pierce continued. Possibly longer. They knew your positions, your extraction routes, your timeline, and your capabilities. That level of intelligence requires either a major breach in operational security, or someone with access to our planning at the highest levels, Jake finished. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a battle that hadn't quite ended. If there was a leak in their operational security, it could compromise not just Jake's team but every special operations unit deployed in the region. But if someone at command level was operating outside normal channels, that raised even more disturbing questions about the nature of the war they were fighting. Pierce gathered the photographs and returned them to the folder. I'm recommending you and your team for 2 weeks of mandatory R&R, she said. Bangkok, Sydney, Dubai, your choice. Get out of theater, decompress, and when you come back we'll discuss next steps. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. Ma'am, my team is ready for immediate redeployment. We don't need. It's not a request, Commander. Pierce's voice carried the authority of 6 years in command and 22 years of military service. What happened last night falls outside normal operational parameters. Until we understand who your mystery woman is and what her agenda might be, I'm not putting you back in a situation where she might make contact again. The dismissal was professional but final. Jake stood, came to attention, and saluted. Understood, ma'am. But as he walked through the corridors of the forward operating base toward his team's quarters, Jake's mind was already working the problem from different angles. He'd spent 16 years learning to read between the lines of military bureaucracy, and Pierce's decision to pull his team from operations suggested she knew more than she was saying. His quarters were a converted shipping container. That had been his home for the past 4 months. 8 feet by 20 feet of personal space in a war zone, furnished with a narrow bunk, a desk made from ammunition crates, and photographs that connected him to a world beyond the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan. The photographs told the story of a life lived in fragments between deployments. His SEAL team graduation, where he looked impossibly young despite being 22. His wedding to Sarah, a nurse he'd met during a training rotation in California, a marriage that had lasted 3 years before the strain of constant deployments tore it apart. A second wedding to Maria, a teacher who'd understood the demands of military life, until she actually experienced them. That one had lasted 5 years and ended with divorce papers served while he was deployed to Iraq. But it was the oldest photograph that drew his attention now. A faded color print of a woman with gentle eyes and dark hair, holding a 7-year-old boy on her lap. His mother, Jake Sullivan, captured in one of the last moments before the accident that had changed everything. Jake, picked up the photograph and studied his mother's face, searching for some connection to the voice he'd heard in the darkness. The mysterious woman had mentioned his mother, had somehow known about the loss that shaped every aspect of his life. How was that possible? His personnel file contained basic biographical information, but the emotional details of his childhood. Trauma weren't documented in any official record. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, setting the photograph back in its place among the others. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez entered, his weathered face showing the same confusion Jake felt. At 38, Rodriguez was a career Navy man who'd worked his way up from enlisted to chief through pure competence and unwavering dedication. He'd been Jake's right-hand man for 5 years, through deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified operations that would never appear in official records. "Skipper," Rodriguez said, using the informal title that reflected their relationship more than Jake's actual rank. "The boys are asking questions about last night. They heard your radio calls, saw the explosion, know something unusual went down." "What do you want me to tell them?" Jake considered the question carefully. His team deserved honesty, but they also deserved protection from the kind of scrutiny that would come if word spread about his encounter with the mystery woman. In the special operations community, reputation was everything, and stories about voices in the darkness could end careers. "Tell them we encountered an unknown friendly asset who provided tactical intelligence that facilitated our extraction," Jake said finally. Emphasize that the asset appeared to be professionally trained and operating with advanced knowledge of enemy positions. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That's the official version. What's the real story?" The question hung between them like a bridge over dangerous water. Rodriguez had earned the right to ask it, had proven his loyalty and discretion through years of successful operations. If Jake was going to confide in anyone, it would be his chief. "The real story is that I don't know what the hell happened out there," Jake admitted. "Someone knew things about our mission they shouldn't have known. Someone knew things about me they couldn't have known. And that same someone saved our lives with precision and timing that suggests either divine intervention or a level of operational capability that exceeds our own." Rodriguez studied Jake's face with the intensity he usually reserved for enemy positions. "You think she make contact again?" "I think last night was just the beginning," Jake replied. "And I think our next deployment is going to be very different from anything we've experienced before." The chief nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. "Skipper, for what it's worth, the boys trust your judgment completely. Whatever happened last night, whatever's going to happen next, we're with you." After Rodriguez left, Jake found himself staring at the photographs again, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying every detail of his encounter with the mystery woman. Her voice had carried an accent he couldn't identify, but there had been something familiar in its cadence, something that reminded him of childhood summers spent with his grandmother in rural Georgia. His grandmother, Rebecca's mother, a strong woman who'd helped raise Jake after his mother's death. She died when Jake was 15, just before he'd enlisted, but her influence had shaped his understanding of strength, duty, and the kind of quiet courage that didn't need to announce itself to the world. The connection was tenuous, probably meaningless, but it nagged at Jake like a tactical detail that didn't quite fit the intelligence picture. He picked up his laptop and began typing an encrypted email to a contact at the Defense Intelligence a former SEAL who now worked the intelligence side of special operations. The email was carefully worded, avoiding specific details while asking for background checks on any female operatives known to be working in the Afghanistan theater. It was a long shot, but Jake's experience had taught him that long shots sometimes revealed unexpected connections. As he hit send, Jake's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message. The number was blocked, the sender identification blank. But somehow Jake knew who it was before he opened the message. "Your team is safe. Your questions have been noted. Patience, Commander Sullivan." Understanding comes to those who wait. Jake stared at the screen, his blood running cold. Someone had his personal satellite phone number, a piece of information that was classified and closely guarded. Someone was monitoring his communications, his movements, his activities. But instead of fear, Jake felt something else rising in his chest. Anticipation. Challenge. The same electric excitement he'd felt before. Every major operation. The knowledge that he was about to embark on something that would test every skill he'd developed over 16 years of military service. He typed a reply. "Who are you?" The response came immediately. Someone who remembers Rebecca Sullivan. Someone who knows the promise you made at her grave. Someone who's been waiting a long time to help you keep that promise. Jake's hands began to shake. The promise he'd made at his mother's grave wasn't recorded anywhere, wasn't something he'd ever discussed with anyone. It was a private moment between an 8-year-old boy and the woman who'd given him life, a vow that had shaped every decision he'd made since. Standing in the Georgia cemetery with rain falling on the casket, Jake had promised his mother he would spend his life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. It was the promise that had driven him through SEAL training, through years of deployments, through personal costs that had left him alone at 44 with nothing but photographs and memories. Whoever was texting him knew about that promise, knew about the deepest, most personal motivation that had guided his entire adult life. Jake's reply was simple. "What do you want?" "To help you fulfill that promise in ways you never imagined possible." "Sleep well, Jake. Tomorrow begins a new chapter." The phone went silent after that, no matter how many times Jake tried to respond. He set it aside and lay back on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling of his shipping container home and trying to process the impossible events of the last 24 hours. Outside, he could hear the familiar sounds of a forward operating base at night. Generators humming, helicopters coming and going, the distant pop of training rounds from the firing range. Normal sounds of military life, comforting in their predictability, but nothing felt normal anymore. The voice in the darkness had opened a door Jake hadn't even known existed, and whatever lay on the other side was going to change everything. As he finally drifted towards sleep, Jake found himself thinking about his mother's voice, trying to remember the exact sound of it after all these years. Rebecca Sullivan had been a gentle woman, a kindergarten teacher who'd read him bedtime stories and sung lullabies that made the monsters in his closet disappear. The mystery woman's voice had carried echoes of that same gentleness, that same protective warmth. It was impossible, of course. His mother had been dead for 36 years. But as Jake slipped into unconsciousness, he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, impossibly, she was still watching over him. Just as the voice in the darkness had promised. The call came at 0347 hours, exactly 1 week after Jake's encounter in the Afghan mountains. His satellite phone buzzed with an urgency that cut through the deepest phase of sleep, jarring him awake in his Bangkok hotel room where he'd been attempting to follow Lieutenant Colonel Pierce's orders for mandatory R&R. Jake grabbed the phone, noting the blocked number that had become familiar over the past 7 days. 3 messages had arrived during the week, each one more cryptic than the last, each one demonstrating knowledge that should have been impossible for any outside party to possess. "Commander Sullivan," came the voice, as clear as if she were standing in the room with him. "I need you to listen very carefully. In approximately 4 hours, your team is going to receive emergency deployment orders. The mission briefing will indicate a hostage rescue operation in northern Pakistan, but the actual objective is significantly different." Jake sat up in bed, instantly alert. "How do you—" Chief Rodriguez will be the first to receive the call, followed by Martinez. Then Kim. The orders will come from Colonel Pierce, but they'll have been originated by someone with authority that supersedes her command structure. Someone who wants to use your team for purposes that have nothing to do with the official mission parameters. The hotel room suddenly felt small and vulnerable. Jake moved to the window and peered through the curtains at the neon-lit streets of Bangkok below. Tourists and locals moved through the night in patterns that seemed normal, unthreatening, but Jake's training had taught him that threats could hide in the most innocent-looking scenarios. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because the mission they're sending you on will result in the death of at least 2 of your team members," the voice replied, and Jake could hear something that might have been pain in her tone. "Because the hostages you think you're rescuing are actually bait in a trap designed to eliminate your entire unit. Because someone has decided that your team knows too much about what happened in Afghanistan." Jake's blood turned to ice. The implications of what she was saying struck him like individual bullets to the chest. Someone in the command structure wanted his team eliminated. Someone with the authority to generate deployment orders and the sophistication to make it look like a legitimate rescue operation gone wrong. "Who?" Jake asked, but he already suspected the answer. "The same people who've been watching your career for the past 6 months, she replied. "The same people who noticed that your team's success rate is statistically impossible without some form of external assistance. The same people who've connected your recent mission anomalies to intelligence leaks they can't explain through conventional analysis." Jake began pacing the small hotel room, his mind racing through the tactical implications. If someone wanted his team eliminated, a fake rescue operation was the perfect cover. High-risk missions had high casualty rates. Equipment failures happened. Intel could be wrong. There were dozens of ways to make a targeted elimination look like operational bad luck. "What intelligence leaks?" he demanded. 3 operations in the past 6 months where your team achieved objectives that should have been impossible based on the intelligence available to you, came the reply. "The Kandahar compound where you rescued 2 hostages despite facing twice the expected resistance. The Helmand Valley operation where you eliminated a high-value target who should have been protected by security measures your briefing never mentioned. The Kunar province mission where you extracted critical intelligence from a location that officially didn't exist." Each reference hit Jake like a physical blow. Those operations had been successful beyond anyone's expectations, but he'd attributed their success to good training, better luck, and the kind of tactical instincts that came from years of experience. He'd never considered that someone might have been providing assistance so subtle he hadn't recognized it. "You," Jake said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "You've been helping us for months." "Years," the voice corrected. "Ever since the Fallujah operation in 2019, where your team was supposed to walk into an ambush that would have killed all 6 of you. Ever since someone noticed that Chief Rodriguez's daughter needed surgery that his military insurance wouldn't cover. Ever since Petty Officer Martinez's wife was having problems with her immigration status that could have resulted in deportation." Jake stopped pacing. The Fallujah operation had been the mission that established his reputation as a commander who could achieve impossible objectives while bringing everyone home alive. Rodriguez's daughter had indeed needed surgery, a complex cardiac procedure that had somehow been covered by a charitable foundation Jake had never heard of. Martinez's wife had received expedited citizenship processing through channels that remained mysterious to this day. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered. "Your team has been under protection for 5 years, Jake," the voice continued. "Someone has been watching over all of you, ensuring that your personal lives remain stable so you could focus on the missions that matter. Someone who recognized that you represent the kind of operators the world needs more of, not fewer." The phone in Jake's hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. 5 years of successful missions, 5 years of his team beating odds that should have been insurmountable, 5 years of personal problems that somehow resolved themselves just before they became serious enough to impact operational effectiveness. "Why?" Jake asked, though he suspected the answer would be more unsettling than the questions themselves. Because the promise you made at your mother's grave wasn't just words to an 8-year-old boy, came the reply. Because Rebecca Sullivan's son was always destined for something greater than routine military operations. Because there are battles being fought in the shadows of this war that require the kind of moral clarity you've demonstrated throughout your career. Jake felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into depths he couldn't fathom. Everything he'd believed about his career, his success, his team's capabilities was being rewritten by revelations that challenged his understanding of reality itself. The deployment orders, he said, forcing himself to focus on the immediate threat. How do I prevent them? You don't, the voice replied. You accept the orders, deploy with your team, and follow the mission parameters exactly as briefed. But you do so with the knowledge that I'll be providing overwatch in ways that your command structure will never detect. That's insane, Jake protested. If you know it's a trap, if you know my team will be walking into an elimination scenario, how can you ask me to? Because it's the only way to identify who's been targeting your operations and eliminate the threat permanently, the voice interrupted. Because running from this problem will only delay the inevitable while putting other teams at risk. Because sometimes the only way through a kill zone is straight ahead with overwhelming force and superior intelligence. The tactical logic was sound, but Jake's protective instincts screamed against putting his team in danger based on the word of someone whose identity remained unknown. Yet everything she'd told him so far had proven accurate. Her intelligence about past operations was perfect. Her knowledge of personal details was impossible to fake, and she'd saved their lives in Afghanistan. I need more than your word, Jake said finally. If I'm going to risk my team's lives, I need proof that you can deliver the kind of protection you're promising. Silence stretched across the satellite connection for a long moment. When the voice returned, it carried a weight that Jake hadn't heard before, a gravity that suggested he'd crossed some kind of threshold. Check your secure email in 10 minutes, she said. You'll find detailed intelligence on the Pakistani operation, including the real identity of the supposed hostages, the actual strength and capabilities of the hostile forces, and the names of the individuals in your command structure who've been compromised. You'll also find personal information about each of your team members that demonstrates the depth of protection they've been receiving. And if I decide not to accept the deployment, Jake asked, then Rodriguez dies in a training accident within the next month. Martinez gets arrested on fabricated drug charges that end his career and destroy his family. Kim receives orders to a duty station where his particular skills make him a target for elimination. And you spend the rest of your life wondering if you could have prevented their deaths by having the courage to trust someone who's been watching over all of you for years. The line went dead, leaving Jake alone with decisions that would determine not just his own fate, but the lives of 3 men who'd followed him through the worst places on Earth without question. He moved to his laptop and waited, counting the minutes until the promised intelligence arrived. When the email notification finally chimed, Jake opened it with hands that trembled slightly despite years of training. Designed to eliminate such reactions, the intelligence package was extensive and professionally formatted. Satellite photographs showed the Pakistani compound from multiple angles, revealing defensive positions that weren't mentioned in any official briefing. Personnel files contained detailed backgrounds on the supposed hostages, revealing them to be intelligence operatives from multiple agencies, whose capture had been staged to justify the rescue operation. But it was the personal files that made Jake's hands shake as he scrolled through them. Rodriguez's daughter's medical records showed not just the cardiac surgery, but 3 other procedures over the past 5 years, all covered by anonymous charitable contributions that totaled over $400,000. Martinez's wife's immigration file contained evidence of legal assistance that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. provided by a law firm that had no record of payment from the Martinez family. Kim's elderly parents in Seoul had received medical care through a foundation that covered expenses their insurance wouldn't, allowing them to remain independent instead of becoming a financial burden that would have destroyed Kim's focus during deployments. Each file painted a picture of lives carefully protected, problems quietly solved, crises averted through resources that none of his team members could have afforded on military salaries. Someone with significant financial resources and intelligence capabilities had been watching over his team's families for years, ensuring that personal problems never became operational distractions. Jake's satellite phone rang again as he finished reading the last file. "Do you understand now?" came the familiar voice. "Do you see the scope of what's been protecting your team? Who are you?" Jake asked for what felt like the 100th time. "Someone who made a promise to your mother before you were born," came the reply, and Jake's world tilted on its axis. "Someone who's been watching over Rebecca Sullivan's son since the day she died in that car accident. Someone who's been waiting 36 years to fulfill an obligation that goes deeper than military duty or operational necessity." The words hit Jake like individual blows to the solar plexus. No one alive knew about the circumstances of his mother's death beyond the basic facts recorded in official documents. The accident had happened on a rainy Tuesday morning when Jake was at school. His mother had been driving to a parent-teacher conference when her car skidded off a wet road and struck a tree. "That's impossible," Jake whispered. "Your mother was 8 weeks pregnant when she died," the voice continued, and Jake felt like he was falling through space. "The doctors told your father, but he decided you were too young to understand that you'd lost not just your mother, but the sister you never got to meet." Rebecca had already chosen a name, Sarah Michelle Sullivan, after her own grandmother. Jake dropped into a chair, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. He'd never known about a sister, had never heard even the slightest hint that his mother had been pregnant when she died. The revelation rewrote not just the story of his loss, but his entire understanding of the life his family might have lived. "How do you know this?" he demanded. "Because I was Rebecca's best friend," came the reply, and Jake could hear tears in the voice now. "Because I was the one she called when she first suspected she was pregnant. Because I was supposed to meet her for lunch the day she died, and I was running late because of a work emergency that seemed so important at the time." The satellite connection carried silence for a long moment as Jake processed revelations that challenged every assumption he'd made about his past. His mother's best friend. Someone who'd been carrying guilt about his mother's death for 36 years. Someone who'd apparently dedicated her life to protecting the son her friend had left behind. "Sarah," Jake said, remembering his mother mentioning a friend with that name in the scattered memories he retained from before the accident. "Sarah Michelle Patterson," came the confirmation. "I took your sister's name when I went into intelligence work as a way of honoring what your family lost that day. I've been Sarah Michelle ever since, working in the shadows to protect the people who can't protect themselves. Starting with Rebecca Sullivan's son." Jake's mind raced through the implications. His mother's best friend had become an intelligence operative, had spent decades building the kind of resources and capabilities necessary to provide protection for his team, had dedicated her life to fulfilling an obligation born from friendship and tragedy. "The deployment orders," Jake said, forcing himself to focus on the immediate threat. "How do we handle them?" "You accept the mission and trust me to provide the kind of overwatch that will turn their trap into their destruction," Sarah Michelle replied. "But first, you need to understand who's been targeting your operations and why." Jake's laptop chimed with another encrypted email. This one contained photographs and biographical information on 3 individuals whose faces he recognized from high-level briefings. Colonel Marcus Webb, assigned to Special Operations Command with oversight responsibility for SEAL team deployments in the Afghanistan theater. a career officer with an exemplary record and security clearances that gave him access to operational details at the highest levels. CIA Deputy Director Patricia Graves, whose portfolio included coordination between military special operations and intelligence agencies. A 20-year veteran of the intelligence community with expertise in counterterrorism and foreign military sales, Pentagon Liaison Officer Major General Richard Stone, whose responsibilities included resource allocation for special operations and coordination with international military partners. A decorated veteran with combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. These three have been working together for 8 months, Sarah Michelle explained as Jake studied the photographs. They've identified your team's success rate as statistically anomalous and have been investigating the source of what they believe to be intelligence leaks. Their investigation led them to conclude that someone within the special operations community has been providing assistance to specific teams, and they've decided that the security risk outweighs the operational benefits. Jake studied the faces of 3 individuals he'd met in various briefing rooms over the past year. Professional, competent, dedicated to the mission of protecting American interests. Yet according to Sarah Michelle, they decided that his team represented a security threat that needed to be eliminated. "Why not just reassign us?" Jake asked. "If they think there's a security issue, why not simply rotate my team out of theater?" "Because they've connected your success rate to intelligence that could only have come from sources they don't control," came the reply. "Sources with capabilities that exceed anything in the official intelligence community. They're convinced that your team has been compromised by a foreign intelligence service, and they believe that capturing and interrogating your team members is the only way to identify the extent of the breach." The tactical situation suddenly became clear to Jake. Webb, Graves, and Stone weren't trying to eliminate his team out of malice. They were trying to protect national security by neutralizing what they perceived as a compromised asset. From their perspective, they were the Patriots, and Jake's team represented an unacceptable security risk. "Except that they're wrong about the source," Jake said. "Completely wrong," Sarah Michelle confirmed. "But their investigation has forced me to accelerate a timeline I've been planning for years. It's time to bring certain capabilities out of the shadows, starting with the protection of your team and ending with the neutralization of threats that go far beyond anything Webb, Graves, and Stone understand." Jake's satellite phone displayed an incoming call from Chief Rodriguez. The deployment orders Sarah Michelle had predicted were about to arrive, exactly on the timeline she'd specified. "Answer it," she instructed. "Accept the mission. Tell your team exactly what you've been told in the official briefing. But know that when you deploy to Pakistan, you'll be walking into a situation where nothing is what it appears to be, where the rules of engagement have been rewritten by people who understand the true nature of the threats we're facing." Jake accepted Rodriguez's call and listened to his chief relay the emergency deployment orders with the professional calm that had characterized their partnership for 5 years. Hostage rescue operation in northern Pakistan. High-value assets requiring immediate extraction. Insertion via helicopter with backup extraction protocols in place. Everything exactly as Sarah Michelle had predicted. "Roger, Chief," Jake replied. "Assemble the team at Bagram Airfield. We'll receive full briefing upon arrival." After ending the call, Jake sat in his Bangkok hotel room and tried to process the fundamental changes that had occurred in his understanding of reality over the past week. His entire career had been shaped by assistance from someone whose existence he'd never suspected. His team's families had been protected by resources he'd never known about. His mother's best friend had dedicated her life to honoring an obligation born from tragedy and guilt. And now that friend was asking him to walk his team into what everyone acknowledged was a trap, based on nothing more than her promise that she could turn their enemies' plan against them. Jake's training told him to contact Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, to report the suspicious intelligence and request a thorough investigation before accepting the deployment. His instincts told him to trust the voice that had already saved his team's lives and had been protecting them for years. His heart told him that Rebecca, Sullivan's son, had always been destined for something greater than routine military operations. Sarah. He said into the satellite phone, using her name for the first time. Yes, Jake. If this goes wrong, if your plan doesn't work, I need to know that you'll protect my team's families after we're gone. Jake, came the reply, and he could hear a smile in her voice despite the gravity of their situation. Your team isn't going to die in Pakistan. You're going to help me eliminate a threat that's been growing in the shadows for years. You're going to discover capabilities and resources that will change your understanding of what's possible in this war. And after Pakistan? After Pakistan, Rebecca Sullivan's son begins the mission he was always meant to complete. After Pakistan, you help me keep the promise I made to your mother before you were born. Jake closed his eyes and thought about the photograph of his mother holding him on her lap, about the promise he'd made at her grave, about the 16 years he'd spent trying to honor that promise through military service. Everything in his life had led to this moment, this decision, this leap of faith based on the word of someone whose existence challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. I'll see you in Pakistan, he said finally. You'll see me long before that, came the reply. Sleep well, Jake. Tomorrow we begin to change everything. The line went dead, leaving Jake alone with preparations that would either vindicate years of trust or result in the destruction of everything he'd spent his career building. But as he packed his gear and prepared to rejoin his team, Jake found himself thinking not about the dangers ahead, but about the possibilities that lay beyond them. For the first time in 36 years, he wasn't facing the future alone. The C-130 transport aircraft cut through Pakistani airspace at 30,000 feet, carrying Jake's team toward what everyone aboard knew might be their final mission. The cargo hold was dimly lit by red lights that preserved night vision while allowing the SEALs to conduct final equipment checks. Rodriguez sat across from Jake, methodically cleaning his M4 carbine with the ritual precision of a man preparing for his own funeral. Martinez was reviewing satellite photographs of the target compound, his young face serious beyond his 23 years. Kim had his sniper rifle disassembled and was inspecting each component with the obsessive attention to detail that had made him one of the most feared marksmen in the special operations community. Jake watched his team and felt the weight of knowledge that none of them shared. They believed they were flying toward a hostage rescue operation. They trusted their intelligence, their equipment, and their commander to bring them home alive. They had no idea that their own command structure had marked them for elimination, that the mission briefing they'd received was designed to place them in an impossible tactical situation. But Jake also carried knowledge that gave him hope. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Sarah Michelle was preparing her own operation, one that would turn their enemy's trap into a weapon against the very people who'd created it. The aircraft's loadmaster approached Jake's position and handed him a sealed envelope. Priority message from command, sir. Eyes only. Jake opened the envelope and found what appeared to be updated intelligence on the target compound. But hidden within the technical diagrams was a message written in a code that only someone with intimate knowledge of his personal history could have created. The red bicycle you got for your 9th birthday had training wheels that your father removed too, early because he thought they made you look weak. You crashed into Mrs. Henderson's rose garden and needed 6 stitches in your left knee. Your mother kissed the bandage every night for a week and told you that scars were proof of courage, not failure. The scar is still visible when you look for it. Jake's blood went cold. The bicycle accident had happened 6 months after his mother's death, when his father was struggling to raise a grieving child while dealing with his own loss. Jake had indeed crashed into their neighbor's rose garden, and the scar was still faintly visible on his left knee when the light hit it just right. But his mother couldn't have kissed the bandage, because she'd been dead for months when the accident occurred. Jake read the message again, searching for some explanation that made sense within the bounds of possibility. But there was only one interpretation that fit the facts. Sarah Michelle had made a mistake, had confused memories of Jake's mother with someone else's experiences. Unless Sarah Michelle wasn't who she claimed to be. The aircraft's intercom crackled to life. 30 minutes to insertion point. Final equipment check. Jake's team moved through their pre-deployment ritual with the automatic precision of professionals who'd done this hundreds of times. But Jake's mind was racing through possibilities. That challenged everything he thought he'd learned about his mysterious benefactor. His satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message. The number was blocked, but Jake had come to recognize the timing and pattern of Sarah Michelle's communications. "You've figured it out, haven't you?" the message read. "You've realized that the bicycle accident story doesn't fit the timeline. You're wondering how someone who died when you were 8 could have been there to comfort you when you were 9. Jake typed a reply. "Who are you really?" The response came immediately. "Someone who's been watching over you in ways that go beyond anything you've been taught to believe possible. Someone who's been keeping a promise that transcends the normal boundaries of life and death. Someone who loves you enough to challenge everything you think you know about reality." Jake stared at the screen, his rational mind rejecting what the message seemed to suggest, while something deeper, something he'd been suppressing since childhood, whispered that impossible things happened in the quiet moments when no one else was looking. 20 minutes to insertion, came the announcement over the intercom. Jake's team was checking weapons and adjusting equipment with the focused intensity that preceded combat. They trusted him to lead them through whatever waited in the darkness ahead. Trusted his judgment even when the mission parameters seemed questionable. Another message appeared on Jake's phone. "Your father never told you what really happened the night your mother died, did he? He never explained why she was driving in the rain to a parent-teacher conference that had been canceled 3 hours earlier. He never mentioned the phone call that made her leave the house despite the weather warnings." Jake's hands began to shake as he read the words. His father had indeed never provided details about the circumstances of his mother's death beyond the basic facts. Car accident, rainy night, mechanical failure that caused the vehicle to skid off the road. End of story. Close the book. Move on with the business of living. "The phone call was from me," the next message read. "I was supposed to meet Rebecca for dinner that night, but I'd been called away on an emergency at work. She was driving to tell me in person that she was pregnant, that she was going to have a daughter, that she wanted me to be the baby's godmother. She died because I wasn't there when she needed me." Jake felt like he was falling through space, his understanding of his family's tragedy rewriting itself with each word. His mother had been driving to meet her best friend. She died because that friend had prioritized work over a dinner appointment. The guilt Sarah Michelle carried wasn't abstract or philosophical. It was the crushing weight of a decision that had cost her best friend's life. 15 minutes to insertion. "But that still doesn't explain how you knew about the bicycle accident." Jake typed, his fingers moving automatically while his conscious mind struggled to process revelations that challenged his fundamental beliefs about the nature of existence. The reply took longer to arrive, and when it did, Jake could sense the weight of truth behind words that asked him to accept what should have been impossible. "Because I never really left, Jake. Because the love between friends, between family, between people who've made promises to each other doesn't end just because the physical form does. Because I've been watching over you from the first moment. After the accident, learning to exist in ways that don't require a body, finding ways to influence events that protect the people I care about." Jake's rational mind screamed in rejection of what the message suggested. Ghost stories, supernatural, intervention, life after death. These were fairy tales, comforting delusions that people created to deal with loss and grief. They had no place in the world of military operations and intelligence analysis, but his heart remembered things his mind had dismissed as childhood imagination. Moments when he'd felt his mother's presence during the difficult years after her death, dreams that seemed more real than waking life. Instances throughout his military career when he'd received warnings or guidance that seemed to come from nowhere, but had saved his life or the lives of his teammates. 10 minutes to insertion. Final systems check. Jake looked around at his team, men who depended on his leadership and judgment to bring them home alive. Rodriguez, who'd followed him through 5 years of successful operations. Martinez, whose young wife was pregnant with their first child. Kim, whose elderly parents depended on the money he sent home every month. All of them trusting Jake to make the right decisions based on intelligence from a source that claimed to be his dead mother's best friend operating from beyond the grave. His phone buzzed with another message. "I know how this sounds. Jake, I know what your training tells you about tactical decisions based on unverifiable intelligence. But look at the evidence. 5 years of successful missions. Your team's family's protected by resources that came from nowhere. Intelligence that's been consistently accurate, despite coming from sources that shouldn't exist." Jake scrolled back through their text conversation and realized that Sarah Michelle had never actually claimed to be alive in the conventional sense. She'd spoken of watching over him, of keeping promises, of existing in ways that transcended normal physical limitations. He'd assumed she was a living person because that was the only framework his training provided for understanding intelligence sources. 5 minutes to insertion. Lock and load. Jake's team chambered rounds and activated their night vision systems, transforming from individuals into a coordinated tactical unit. But Jake remained focused on his phone, typing questions that would determine whether he was about to lead his team to safety or destruction. "If you're really who you claim to be, prove it. Tell me something that only my mother could have known." The response came immediately. "When you were 6 years old, you were afraid of the monster that lived under your bed. Your mother made you a special flashlight, painted it blue because that was your favorite color, and told you it had magic powers that could make monsters disappear. You kept that flashlight under your pillow for 2 years, even after she died. It's in a box in your storage unit in Virginia Beach, along with her jewelry and the baby clothes she'd already bought for your sister." Jake's world went completely still. The flashlight was indeed in his storage unit, packed away with other childhood belongings he'd never been able to discard. He'd never mentioned it to anyone, had never told even his wives about the blue flashlight that had protected him from childhood fears. Only his mother could have known about the flashlight. Only his mother could have remembered painting it blue. Could have known about the magic powers she'd promised it possessed. 2 minutes to insertion. Jake looked up from his phone and saw 3 men whose lives depended on decisions he was about to make based on communication with someone who should have been impossible. But the evidence was overwhelming. The successful missions, the protected families, the accurate intelligence, the intimate knowledge of details no living person could possess. His mother's best friend was keeping a promise that had somehow transcended death itself. Jake keyed his throat mic and addressed his team for what might be the last time. "Listen up. The intelligence for this mission may be compromised. The hostages we're supposed to extract may not be legitimate. The compound may be more heavily defended than briefed. But we're going in anyway because running from this problem will only put other teams at risk." Rodriguez looked up from his weapon. "Skipper, if the intel is compromised, why not abort? Because sometimes the only way to solve a problem is to go straight through it with overwhelming force and superior intelligence," Jake replied, using Sarah Michelle's words. "Because we've got Overwatch from a source that's never let us down. Because this is what we trained for." His phone buzzed with a final message. "I'm proud of you, Jake. Your mother would be proud of you. In 10 minutes you're going to understand." Capabilities and resources that will change your understanding of what's possible. Trust me. Trust her. Trust the promise that's been protecting you all these years. 1 minute to insertion. Jake pocketed his phone and checked his weapon one final time. Whatever waited in the darkness ahead, trap, rescue mission, or something else entirely, he would face it with the knowledge that someone who loved him had been watching over his team for years, someone who'd been keeping a promise that went beyond the normal boundaries of life and death, someone who was about to demonstrate capabilities that would challenge everything. Jake thought he knew about the nature of reality itself. The aircraft's rear door opened, revealing the star-filled darkness of the Pakistani night. Wind roared through the cargo hold as Jake's team prepared for insertion into unknown territory. Go, 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 came the command. Jake stepped into empty space, his team following behind him, all of them falling through darkness toward answers that would redefine their understanding of the war they'd been fighting and the forces that had been protecting them. Throughout their careers, his parachute deployed and the ground rushed up to meet him. Jake found himself thinking about promises made at gravesides, about friendships that transcended death, about the thin line between the possible and the impossible in a world where nothing was ever quite what it seemed. At 8 minutes, he would learn that some lines weren't meant to be crossed. They were meant to be erased entirely. Jake's boots hit Pakistani soil at 0247 hours. The impact absorbed by legs that had made hundreds of similar landings throughout his career. His team landed in perfect formation, their parachutes automatically collapsing as they activated quick-release mechanisms and transitioned to tactical positioning. Within 90 seconds, they had established a defensive perimeter and confirmed all personnel accounted for. But something was different about this insertion. As Jake gathered his parachute and checked his equipment, he noticed lights in the distance that hadn't appeared in any of their briefing materials. Not the harsh fluorescent illumination of security installations, but softer, more organic lighting that seemed to move through the landscape with purpose. "Skipper," Rodriguez whispered through the comm system, "we've got movement on the eastern ridge. Multiple contacts, but they're not behaving like hostiles." Jake raised his night vision scope and studied the rid Rodriguez had indicated. What he saw defied tactical logic. Figures were moving along the ridgeline, but instead of taking cover or establishing fighting positions, they seemed to be setting up some kind of equipment. Sophisticated electronic gear that gleamed with the dull metallic finish of military-grade hardware. "Overwatch, this is Phantom 6, Jake whispered into his throat mic, using their established communication protocol for base contact. "We're observing unknown personnel establishing positions on elevated terrain. Request guidance on rules of engagement." Static filled his earpiece for a moment, then came a voice Jake didn't recognize. "Phantom 6, Overwatch is currently ... unavailable. You are cleared to proceed with mission parameters as briefed. Maintain radio silence until objective is secured." Jake frowned. The voice wasn't Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, or any of the other officers who normally handled communications for his team's operations. The speaker had hesitated before saying "unavailable," as if searching for words to explain something that didn't have an easy explanation. His satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from the now familiar blocked number. "The people on the ridge are mine. Jake, they're providing electronic overwatch and communication security for your operation. Your normal command structure has been temporarily interrupted to prevent interference with what's about to happen." Jake typed a quick reply. "What do you mean interrupted?" "Webb, Graves, and Stone are currently in a classified briefing that will last exactly as long as your mission requires," came the response. "They believe they're receiving updated intelligence on terrorist financing networks. They have no idea that their communications have been isolated and their ability to interfere with your operation has been neutralized." The tactical implications hit Jake like individual puzzle pieces falling into place. Someone with extraordinary resources and capabilities had engineered a complete operational environment, isolating his team from their normal command structure, while providing protection from unknown assets on the high ground. "Martinez," Jake whispered to his youngest team member, "what's your read on the compound?" Martinez studied the target through his night vision scope. "Structure matches briefing materials, but thermal signatures are all wrong. Building shows signs of recent heating and cooling that suggest more personnel than intelligence indicated. Kim, can you get eyes on the interior through those windows?" Kim adjusted his sniper scope and spent several minutes studying the compound through advanced optics. "Negative on visual confirmation of hostages, Skipper. But I'm seeing movement patterns. That suggests this isn't a hostage situation. Personnel inside are moving freely, not exhibiting behavior consistent with captivity." Jake's assessment was confirmed by everything his team was observing. The supposed hostages weren't being held against their will. The compound wasn't configured for detention. The entire scenario was exactly what Sarah Michelle had warned him about, an elaborate trap designed to justify the elimination of his team. But Sarah Michelle had also promised that she would turn their enemy's plan against them. "Phantom 6, this is Sierra Mike," came a new voice through Jake's earpiece. A woman's voice, calm and professional, speaking with the kind of authority that demanded attention. "I'm assuming tactical control of your operation effective immediately. Your mission parameters are changing." Jake recognized the voice. It was the same one that had whispered "Friendlies approaching" in the Afghan mountains, the same one that had been guiding him through text messages for the past week. But now she was speaking directly through his communication system, indicating capabilities that went far beyond anything he'd imagined. "Sierra Mike, confirm your authority for this operation," Jake replied, using standard military protocol for challenging unknown command voices. "My authority comes from promises made before you were born, Jake," came the reply. And Jake could hear a smile in her voice despite the gravity of their situation. "My authority comes from 16 years of successful operations that wouldn't have been possible without my assistance. My authority comes from the fact that I'm about to save your life and the lives of your team." Jake looked around at his men, all of them monitoring the radio traffic and waiting for his decision. They'd followed him through impossible situations before, trusting his judgment even when the tactical picture didn't make complete sense. But this was different. This was asking them to trust a voice they'd never heard before, operating with capabilities that challenged their understanding of how military operations were conducted. "Rodriguez Martinez, Kim," Jake said quietly. "We've got a new tactical controller. Unknown call sign, unknown authority, but consistent with intelligence sources that have kept us alive for years. I'm requesting your confidence in accepting revised mission parameters." The responses came back immediately in the order Jake had expected. "If you trust her, Skipper, so do I," from Rodriguez. "Roger that, sir," from Martinez. "Copy, boss," from Kim. Jake keyed his mic. "Sierra Mike, Phantom 6 is ready to receive revised mission parameters." "Excellent," came the reply. "Your new objective is to secure the compound and extract intelligence on the personnel who've been using this location to coordinate attacks against your command structure. The individuals inside aren't hostages. They're intelligence operatives working for Webb, Graves, and Stone. They've been conducting surveillance on special operations teams and identifying units that show statistical anomalies in success rates." Jake felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The compound wasn't a terrorist facility. It was an intelligence collection site operated by the same people who'd ordered his team's elimination. Webb, Graves, and Stone had been using Pakistani territory to conduct surveillance on American military units, searching for evidence of the external assistance that had been protecting Jake's team. "How do you want us to proceed?" Jake asked. "Standard. Clear and secure operations, but with one modification, Sierra Mike replied. I need you to access their computer systems and download everything. Personnel files, communication logs, operational records, financial transactions. Everything that proves what they've been doing. Jake signaled his team to begin movement toward the compound. As they advanced, he noticed that the figures on the eastern ridge were tracking their movement with what appeared to be advanced surveillance equipment. But instead of feeling exposed, Jake felt protected. For the first time in his career, he was operating with overwatch that exceeded anything the military could provide. The compound's perimeter was easier to breach than intelligence had suggested. No razor wire, no motion sensors, no defensive positions that would be expected at a terrorist facility. It was configured for concealment and communication, not for withstanding assault by military forces. Something's wrong with this picture, Rodriguez whispered as they approached the main building. Security measures are minimal. Almost like they weren't expecting military contact. Because they weren't, Jake replied, understanding flooding through him. They were expecting to conduct surveillance, not to defend against attack. They thought we were walking into an ambush, not bringing one to their doorstep. Jake's team moved through the compound with the fluid precision that had made them one of the most effective special operations units in the theater. But instead of encountering armed resistance, they found intelligence operatives who seemed shocked by the appearance of American military personnel. The first room contained 3 men in civilian clothes sitting at computer workstations that displayed real-time tracking data on various military units. Maps on the walls showed deployment patterns for special operations teams throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan. File cabinets contained dossiers on individual operators, with Jake's team featured prominently among them. Jesus Christ, Martinez whispered as he studied one of the computer screens. They've been tracking us for months. Movement patterns, success rates, casualty reports, everything. Secure those computers, Jake ordered. Download everything. I want to know exactly what they've been collecting and who they've been reporting to. As his team worked to extract intelligence, Jake studied the materials spread around the room. The surveillance operation was extensive and sophisticated, involving multiple agencies and significant financial resources. Someone had invested millions of dollars in tracking American special operations units, searching for evidence of external assistance or foreign intelligence penetration, but they'd been looking for the wrong kind of assistance. Sierra Mike, Jake whispered into his throat mic. We're looking at evidence of a massive surveillance operation targeting American military personnel. How long has this been going on? 18 months, came the reply. Webb convinced Graves and Stone that your team's success rate indicated possible compromise by foreign intelligence services. They've been building a case for eliminating not just your team, but several others that show similar statistical anomalies. Jake's blood ran cold. Other teams. Other operators whose only crime was being too successful at missions that should have been impossible. How many other teams? He asked. 14 units across multiple services, Sierra Mike replied. SEAL teams, Delta Force, Special Forces groups, Marine Force reconnaissance. All of them showing success rates that Webb's statistical analysis flagged as impossible without external assistance. Jake looked around at the intelligence collection site and realized he was looking at evidence of a purge. Webb, Graves, and Stone had identified the most effective special operations units in the American military and had decided they represented security threats that needed to be eliminated. Skipper, Kim called from another room, you need to see this. Jake moved to Kim's position and found himself looking at detailed files on each of the 14 targeted units. Personnel records, family information, deployment schedules, psychological profiles. Everything someone would need to orchestrate. Elimination operations that would appear to be operational casualties rather than targeted assassinations, but it was the timeline that made Jake's hands shake as he read through the documents. The first elimination was scheduled for the following week. A Delta Force team operating in Syria would receive orders for a mission that would result in their complete destruction. The week after that, a SEAL team in Iraq would walk into an ambush that would leave no survivors. Systematic elimination of America's most effective special operations personnel, orchestrated by individuals with the authority and resources to make it appear like operational bad luck rather than deliberate murder. Download everything, Jake ordered his team. Every file, every communication, every piece of evidence that proves what they've been planning. As his team worked, Jake's satellite phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Michelle. You're looking at the evidence of something bigger than elimination operations. Jake, Webb, Graves, and Stone aren't acting independently. They're part of a network that's been infiltrating the American military and intelligence communities for years. This compound is just one node in a larger operation. Jake typed a reply. What kind of operation? The kind that requires capabilities you're about to discover, came the response. The kind that explains why I've been protecting your team for years. The kind that justifies promises that transcend normal human limitations. Jake was about to ask for clarification when explosions began echoing from the direction they'd approached. Not the controlled demolitions of military operations, but the chaotic signatures of a facility being systematically destroyed. Sierra Mike, Jake called into his throat mic. We've got explosions to our east. Request status on friendly forces. The surveillance facility that's been monitoring your operations is currently being neutralized, came the reply. Webb, Graves, and Stone built a comprehensive intelligence collection network throughout this region. Tonight, we're dismantling all of it. Through the compound's windows, Jake could see explosions lighting up the night sky in multiple directions. Not random destruction, but coordinated demolition of targets that had been precisely identified and systematically eliminated. How many people do you have? Jake asked in amazement. Enough, came the simple reply. Enough to protect every team that Webb targeted for elimination. Enough to neutralize the surveillance network they built. Enough to ensure that this kind of threat never develops again. Jake's team finished downloading the intelligence and prepared to withdraw from the compound. As they moved toward their extraction point, Jake realized that the night had been more than a successful mission. It had been a demonstration of capabilities that exceeded anything he'd imagined possible. Someone with extraordinary resources had been protecting America's most effective special operations personnel while simultaneously gathering evidence on the people who threatened them. Someone had built an intelligence network that surpassed official government capabilities while remaining completely invisible to conventional detection methods. Someone who'd been keeping a promise made to his mother before he was born. As Jake's team reached their extraction point, helicopters appeared on the horizon. But these weren't the standard military aircraft they'd expected. These were advanced machines with capabilities that suggested technology beyond anything in the official military inventory. Sierra Mike, Jake said into his throat mic as the helicopters approached. Those aren't standard extraction aircraft. No, they're not, came the reply, and Jake could hear satisfaction in her voice. They're part of capabilities that have been developed over the past decade to protect people like you. Technology that exists outside official military channels, funded by resources that don't appear in any government budget. The lead helicopter settled into the landing zone with the kind of precision that spoke of advanced flight systems and exceptional pilot training. As the aircraft's doors opened, Jake saw figures in tactical gear that was unlike anything in the standard military inventory. Advanced body armor, weapon systems that seemed to incorporate technologies he didn't recognize, communication equipment that suggested capabilities far beyond conventional military standards. But it was the figure who stepped out of the lead aircraft that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. She was tall and slender, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years in combat zones. Her face was partially obscured by tactical gear, but her eyes were visible through advanced night vision systems. And those eyes! Jake felt recognition stirring in memories he'd thought were lost forever. "Hello, Jake," she said, removing her helmet to reveal features that were both familiar and impossible. "It's been a long time since I could speak to you face to face." Jake stared at the woman walking toward him and felt his understanding of reality fracture completely. The face was older than it should have been, marked by years of experiences. That should never have happened. But the eyes were unmistakable, the smile exactly as he remembered it from childhood photographs. "That's impossible," Jake whispered. "A lot of impossible things have happened tonight," she replied, stopping just outside arm's reach. "A lot of impossible things have been happening for years, protecting you and your team while you focused on missions that mattered." Jake's team was staring at the woman with expressions of confusion and growing recognition. They'd been listening to her voice through their communication systems, had been following her orders, had trusted her judgment throughout the night's operation. But seeing her in person challenged everything they thought they understood about their mysterious benefactor. "Sarah Michelle Patterson," Jake said, his voice barely audible above the sound of helicopter rotors. "Sarah Michelle Sullivan," she corrected. "I took your mother's name when I realized the scope of what protecting you would require. I needed an identity that could access resources and capabilities that don't officially exist." Jake felt like he was looking at a ghost, but ghosts didn't wear tactical gear or coordinate military operations. Ghosts didn't pilot advanced aircraft or command resources that exceeded government capabilities. "You're supposed to be dead," Jake said. "I was," she replied simply. "For about 4 minutes, on the side of a road in Georgia 36 years ago. Long enough to understand that death isn't what most people think it is. Long enough to make a choice about what I wanted to do with whatever time I had left." Jake's rational mind rejected what she was saying, but the evidence stood before him. Advanced technology, sophisticated operations, resources that had protected his team for years. All of it coordinated by someone who should have been impossible. "The car accident," Jake said. "Wasn't an accident," Sarah Michelle replied. "Rebecca was driving to meet me because I'd asked her to. She was going to tell me about the pregnancy, about her plans for your sister, about how happy she was despite the challenges of raising a child in a military family. She died because someone didn't want that conversation to happen." Jake felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "Someone?" "The same network that Webb, Graves, and Stone work for today," she explained. "The same people who've been infiltrating American military and intelligence services for decades." Rebecca had stumbled onto something in her work at the elementary school, had noticed patterns in the children of military personnel that suggested systematic targeting of families. The revelations hit Jake like individual bombs exploding in his consciousness. His mother's death hadn't been a random accident. She'd been murdered because she'd discovered evidence of threats against military families. The guilt that Sarah Michelle carried wasn't just about missing a dinner appointment. It was about failing to protect her best friend from people who'd marked her for elimination. "What did she discover?" Jake asked. "That someone was using information from military family support programs to identify and target the children of special operations personnel," Sarah Michelle replied. "Rebecca was documenting cases of accidents, illnesses, and behavioral problems that affected military children at rates far above normal populations. She was preparing to take her findings to military authorities when they decided she'd learned too much." Jake thought about his own childhood after his mother's death, about the years of difficulty and trauma that had shaped his development. He'd always attributed his problems to natural grief and the challenges of being raised by a single father dealing with his own loss. "I was targeted too," he realized. "You were supposed to die in the same accident that killed your mother, Sarah." Michelle confirmed. You were supposed to be in the car that night, but you came down with a fever that afternoon, and Rebecca decided to leave you home with a babysitter rather than drag you out in bad weather. Jake felt like he was looking at his entire life through a new lens. The accident that had defined his childhood hadn't been random tragedy. It had been attempted murder, thwarted only by a childhood illness that had kept him home that night. The 4 minutes you were dead, Jake said. What happened? Sarah Michelle's expression grew distant, as if she were accessing memories that existed outside normal human experience. I learned that consciousness doesn't end with physical death. I learned that love and commitment can transcend normal biological limitations. I learned that promises made to dying friends create obligations that extend beyond anything most people understand. She paused, looking at Jake with eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. I learned that some battles require capabilities that exist outside the normal boundaries of life and death. And I chose to develop those capabilities rather than moving on to whatever comes next. Jake's team was listening to every word, their faces showing the same combination of disbelief and growing acceptance that Jake felt. They'd followed Sarah Michelle's guidance through successful missions, had seen evidence of her capabilities, had trusted her judgment with their lives. The revelation that she was operating from beyond normal human limitations explained the scope of her resources while challenging everything they thought they knew about reality. The network that killed your mother has been growing for decades, Sarah Michelle continued. They've infiltrated military commands, intelligence agencies, contractor organizations, political structures. They're not foreign agents or traditional enemies. They're American citizens who've decided that democracy and constitutional government are obstacles to achieving their vision of how the world should be ordered. A coup, Rodriguez said quietly. A slow-motion coup that's been in progress for 20 years, Sarah Michelle confirmed. They've been eliminating military personnel who show exceptional competence and moral clarity, the kind of operators who would pose a threat if they ever realized what was happening. Webb, Graves, and Stone are just the current phase of a larger operation. Jake studied the woman who'd been protecting his team for years and realized that she represented something unprecedented in his understanding of the world. Someone who'd chosen to exist in the space between life and death, developing capabilities that exceeded government resources while maintaining the personal motivations that had defined her living existence. What happens now? Jake asked. Now. We finish what we started tonight, Sarah Michelle replied. We've gathered evidence on the network that killed your mother and has been targeting special operations personnel. We've neutralized their surveillance capabilities and documented their plans for systematic elimination of America's best military units. Now we take that evidence to people who have the authority and integrity to act on it. She gestured toward the helicopters, which Jake now realized represented just a fraction of the resources she developed over the past 3 decades. We've got congressional allies who've been investigating unusual patterns in military casualties. We've got journalists who've been tracking financial connections between defense contractors and political organizations. We've got military commanders who've suspected systematic targeting, but lacked evidence to prove it. And after that? Jake asked. After that, you helped me build something new, Sarah Michelle replied. A protection network for military personnel who embody the kind of values this country needs more of, not fewer. An intelligence capability that operates outside official channels, but serves the same fundamental principles. A way of ensuring that people like your mother never die for discovering truths that threaten corrupt power structures. Jake looked at his team, Rodriguez, Martinez, Kim, and saw a reflection of his own thoughts in their faces. They'd spent their careers serving a system that had ultimately marked them for elimination. But they'd also discovered that someone had been protecting them, someone who understood the true nature of the threats they faced. What would that look like? Jake asked, Like tonight, Sarah Michelle replied. Coordinated operations that neutralize threats while protecting the people who matter. Intelligence gathering that identifies corruption before it becomes systematic. Resources that exist outside official budgets but serve the same fundamental mission. She paused, studying Jake's face with the intensity of someone who'd been watching over him for 36 years. It would look like keeping the promise I made to your mother and the promise you made at her grave. Protecting people who can't protect themselves, but doing it with capabilities that exceed anything the official system can provide, Jake thought. About the photograph of his mother holding him on her lap, about the 8-year-old boy who'd promised to spend his life serving others, about 16 years of military service that had led him to this moment of impossible revelation. The other teams that were targeted, Jake said. What happens to them? They're being contacted tonight by people they trust, being given evidence of the threats against them, being offered the same choice I'm offering you, Sarah Michelle replied. Some will choose to remain within official military structures, working to reform the system from inside. Others will choose to work with us, developing capabilities that operate outside those structures while serving the same fundamental principles. Jake looked at the advanced helicopters, at the sophisticated equipment his team had used during the night's operation, at the woman who'd somehow transcended death to protect the people she cared about. Everything challenged his understanding of what was possible, but everything also made sense within the context of promises that went deeper than military duty. Jake, Sarah Michelle said softly, and for a moment her voice carried echoes of the childhood memories he'd treasured for 36 years. Your mother would be proud of the man you've become. She would be proud of the choices you've made, the people you've protected, the principles you've maintained despite personal cost. Jake felt tears in his eyes for the first time since his mother's funeral. Is she? She's where she needs to be, Sarah Michelle replied. But she asked me to tell you that the promise you made at her grave has been kept, and that it's time to make new promises that will protect the next generation. Jake looked at his team, at the evidence they'd gathered, at the resources that had been protecting them for years. The choice Sarah Michelle was offering wasn't just about their own survival. It was about creating something that would protect other operators, other families, other people who embodied the values that made America worth defending. Rodriguez, Jake said to his chief, what do you think? I think we've been protected by capabilities we never understood, following orders from someone who's never let us down, Rodriguez replied. I think if she's offering us a chance to do the same for others, it's worth serious consideration. Martinez and Kim nodded agreement, their faces showing the same recognition Jake felt. They'd found something bigger than military careers, bigger than official channels, bigger than conventional understanding of what was possible. Sarah Michelle, Jake said, using her name with the respect it deserved. We're in. She smiled, and for a moment, Jake could see echoes of the woman who'd been his mother's best friend, who'd carried guilt for 36 years, who'd chosen to exist between life and death rather than abandon the people she'd promised to protect. Then, let's go change the world, she said. As Jake's team boarded the advanced helicopters, Jake realized that the night had been more than a successful mission or a narrow escape from elimination. It had been a transformation, a revelation of capabilities and resources that would allow them to serve their deepest principles while operating outside the limitations of official structures. That the aircraft lifted off into the Pakistani night, carrying them toward a future that none of them could have imagined when they'd accepted what they thought was a routine deployment order. But as Jake watched the landscape pass beneath them, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. He felt protected not just by advanced technology or sophisticated resources, but by love that had transcended normal human limitations, by promises that had been kept across decades and beyond death itself, by someone who'd chosen to exist in impossible ways rather than abandon the people she cared about. For the first time since his mother's death, Jake Sullivan wasn't facing the future alone. 3 months later, the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room buzzed with tension as Chairman Senator Patricia Williams called the session to order. Cameras lined the walls, congressional staffers whispered urgently into phones, and journalists filled every available seat in the gallery. But all attention focused on the witness table, where 3 individuals sat in dress blue uniforms, their faces calm despite the storm of controversy that had brought them to this moment. Commander Jake Sullivan, Chief Petty Officer Martinez Rodriguez, and Petty Officer First Class David Kim represented more than just a SEAL team testifying before Congress. They represented the 14 special operations units that had been targeted for elimination, the hundreds of families that had been protected by resources they'd never known about, and the revelation of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the American military and intelligence communities. Commander Sullivan, Senator Williams began, her voice carrying the weight of 6 weeks of closed-door hearings that had preceded this public session. Please tell this committee, in your own words, what you discovered during your operations in Pakistan 3 months ago. Jake leaned toward the microphone, his dress blue uniform displaying ribbons that told the story of 16 years of distinguished service. But the story he was about to tell went far beyond anything reflected in his official decorations. Ma'am, my team discovered evidence of a systematic operation targeting American Special Operations personnel for elimination. Jake began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. We found detailed files on 14 military units whose success rates had been identified as statistically anomalous, along with operational plans for missions designed to result in the deaths of all personnel in those units. Senator Williams held up a thick folder containing documents that had been declassified for the hearing. These files were obtained during your operation in Pakistan? Yes, ma'am. Along with communication records, financial transactions, and personnel files that documented 18 months of surveillance on American military units. And who was conducting this surveillance? Jake's jaw tightened. Colonel Marcus Webb, CIA. Deputy Director Patricia Graves, and Pentagon Liaison Officer Major General Richard Stone, operating through a network of intelligence assets in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The gallery erupted in whispers at the mention of names that had dominated headlines since Jake's team had presented their evidence to congressional investigators. All 3 individuals were currently in federal custody, facing charges of treason, conspiracy, and murder in connection with operations that had resulted in the deaths of dozens of military personnel over the past 2 years. But Webb, Graves, and Stone represented only the visible portion of a network that had been infiltrating American military and intelligence services for decades. The full scope of the conspiracy was still being investigated by a joint congressional committee that had been formed specifically to address the revelations Jake's team had brought forward. Commander Sullivan, said Senator Robert Hayes, the committee's ranking minority member, your testimony indicates that your team received assistance from sources outside official military channels. Can you elaborate on the nature of that assistance? Jake had spent weeks preparing for this question, working with congressional investigators and military legal counsel to frame his response in terms that would be both truthful and comprehensible to people who operated within conventional understanding of intelligence capabilities. Senator, my team received tactical intelligence and operational support from assets that were operating independently of official military command structures. Jake replied carefully. These assets demonstrated capabilities that exceeded conventional military resources and provided protection for my team and the families of team members over a period of several years. And the identity of these assets remains classified, pending ongoing investigations, Jake replied, using language that had been agreed upon with congressional leadership. I can confirm that these assets were loyal Americans operating in support of constitutional principles and the protection of military personnel. who were being targeted by the conspiracy we uncovered. The truth was more complex than anything Jake could reveal in public testimony. Sarah Michelle's organization had grown far beyond what he'd initially understood, incorporating resources and capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of what was possible in intelligence operations. But the evidence they'd provided had been sufficient to expose the network, targeting special operations personnel while protecting the methods and sources that had made that exposure possible. 6 months later, the wedding reception was held at the Officers Club at Naval Air Station Oceana, where Jake's team had been reassigned following their congressional testimony and the subsequent reorganization of Special Operations Command structures. Martinez was marrying his longtime girlfriend Elena, in a ceremony that brought together family members who'd traveled from across the country to witness the celebration. But as Jake watched Martinez dance with his new wife, he wasn't thinking about the wedding. He was thinking about the files Sarah Michelle had shown him 6 months ago. Files that detailed how Lena's immigration problems had been quietly resolved through legal assistance that the Martinez family could never have afforded. "You clean up nice, Skipper," Rodriguez said, approaching Jake's position at the edge of the dance floor. The chief was wearing his dress blue uniform with decorations that included a Navy Cross received 3 months earlier for extraordinary heroism during classified operations in support of national security. "You too, Chief," Jake replied, noting that Rodriguez looked more relaxed than he had in years. Rodriguez's daughter had recently undergone her 3rd cardiac surgery, this time at Johns Hopkins Hospital, with all expenses covered by a foundation that had been established specifically to provide medical care for the families of military personnel. "Any word from our mysterious benefactor?" Rodriguez asked quietly. Jake nodded toward a figure standing near the bar, a woman in civilian dress who was engaged in conversation with Kim's parents. To most observers, she appeared to be just another guest at the wedding. But Jake recognized the subtle signs of someone who'd spent decades operating in hostile environments, the way she positioned herself to monitor entrances and exits, the manner in which she kept her hands free and ready, the constant situational awareness that marked professional operators. "She's here," Jake confirmed. Sarah Michelle had become a regular presence in their lives over the past 6 months, though. Her appearances were always brief, and her methods remained largely mysterious. She'd attended Rodriguez's daughter's surgery, had been present at the congressional hearings, though not in any official capacity, and had somehow arranged for Kim's parents to receive expedited visas that allowed them to attend the wedding. But she'd also been coordinating something larger, something that involved the other military units that had been targeted by Webb's conspiracy. Jake had been contacted by commanders from Delta Force, Marine Force Reconnaissance, and Army Special Forces, all of them reporting similar experiences with mysterious assistants and protected family members. The network that Sarah Michelle had built was protecting dozens of military families while gathering intelligence on threats that operated outside conventional detection methods. It was everything she'd promised during that night in Pakistan, and more than Jake had ever imagined possible. 1 year later, the briefing room at the Pentagon was smaller than the congressional hearing room, but the people gathered around the table represented significantly more authority. Defense Secretary Michael Richardson sat at the head of the table, flanked by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the directors of the CIA, NSA, and DIA. Jake sat across from them, now wearing the insignia of a Navy commander with responsibilities that went far beyond leading a single SEAL team. His official title was Director of Special Operations Integration, but his actual role involved coordinating between official military structures and the intelligence assets that Sarah Michelle's organization had developed. "Commander Sullivan," Secretary Richardson began, "please brief us on the current status of Operation Guardian Angel." Jake opened a classified folder containing reports that documented 18 months of unprecedented success in protecting American military personnel from threats that had previously operated with impunity. Mr. Secretary, Guardian Angel has identified and neutralized 47 separate operations targeting American military families over the past year, Jake reported. We've prevented 11 planned assassinations, exposed 6 financial fraud schemes targeting military personnel, and disrupted 23 operations designed to compromise military family members through blackmail or coercion. The numbers represented more than statistical achievements. Each prevented operation had saved lives, protected families, and preserved the operational effectiveness of military units that formed the backbone of American national security. And the source of your intelligence? Asked CIA Director Sarah Chun. Remains compartmentalized as previously agreed, Jake replied. I can confirm that our intelligence sources operate independently of foreign government influence and maintain full loyalty to American constitutional principles. The arrangement had taken months to negotiate, but ultimately practical necessity had overcome bureaucratic concerns about unconventional intelligence methods. Sarah Michelle's organization consistently provided actionable intelligence that prevented threats to American military personnel, and their methods never compromised ongoing official operations. The intelligence community had learned to work with assets whose capabilities exceeded their own while respecting the operational security requirements that kept those assets effective. What's your assessment of long-term sustainability? Asked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Jake considered the question carefully. Over the past year, he'd gained deeper understanding of the resources and capabilities that Sarah Michelle had developed. Her organization operated through a network of individuals who'd chosen to work outside official structures while maintaining the same fundamental mission of protecting American interests. Some were former military personnel who'd been recruited after completing official service. Others were intelligence professionals who'd become disillusioned with bureaucratic limitations. Still others were individuals with specialized skills who'd been brought into the organization through methods that Jake didn't fully understand but had learned to respect. Sir, I believe we're looking at a permanent enhancement to American intelligence capabilities, Jake replied. The threats we're facing require resources and methods that operate outside conventional limitations. Our partners have demonstrated consistent effectiveness while maintaining operational security that exceeds official standards. And the ethical considerations? Asked NSA Director Thomas Park. It was a question Jake had wrestled with throughout his involvement with Sarah Michelle's organization. The capabilities she demonstrated challenged conventional understanding of intelligence operations while serving principles that aligned with American constitutional values. Sir, every operation we've conducted has been in support of protecting American military personnel and their families from legitimate threats, Jake replied. Our partners operate under strict ethical guidelines that prioritize American lives and constitutional principles above operational convenience. The briefing continued for another hour, covering operational details and resource requirements that would determine the future relationship between official intelligence agencies and the organization that Sarah Michelle had built. But as Jake walked through the Pentagon's corridors afterward, he found himself thinking about promises that had shaped his entire adult life. The promise he'd made at his mother's grave. The promise Sarah Michelle had made to protect Rebecca Sullivan's son. The promise they'd all made to build something that would protect future generations of military personnel from threats that operated in the shadows. 5 years later, the elementary school in Virginia Beach was typical of military communities. Diverse, resilient, filled with children whose parents served in various branches of the armed forces. Jake walked through the corridors toward the classroom where he'd been invited to speak, noting security measures that hadn't existed when he was a child, but had become necessary as threats against military families had evolved. The invitation had come from Mrs. Sarah Patterson, a kindergarten teacher who worked with the children of Special Operations personnel. When Jake had seen the name, he'd immediately recognized the significance. Sarah Michelle had somehow arranged for him to speak at a school where she worked under the same cover identity she'd used for decades. Jake entered the classroom and found 23 children seated in a circle, their faces bright with the kind of curiosity that reminded him of his own childhood. But it was the teacher who drew his attention, Sarah Michelle, looking exactly as she had during their first face-to-face meeting in Pakistan, working with military children in the same profession his mother had chosen. "Children," she announced, "this is Commander Sullivan. He's going to tell us about serving our country and protecting the people we care about." Jake spent the next hour talking to the children about military service, about the importance of protecting others, about making choices that served principles larger than personal interests. But as he spoke, he noticed things that reminded him of the files Sarah Michelle had shown him years earlier, security measures that exceeded normal school requirements, staff members who moved with the kind of awareness that suggested professional training, technology that provided capabilities beyond what most educational institutions possessed. Sarah Michelle was doing more than teaching kindergarten. She was operating a protection network that began with the children of military families, ensuring that the next generation would be safer than the one that had produced Jake's team. After his presentation, Jake waited in the hallway while Sarah Michelle finished with her students. When she finally emerged from the classroom, she looked exactly as she had 30 years earlier, unchanged, timeless, carrying the same gentle strength that had defined his memories of his mother's best friend. "Thank you for coming," she said. And Jake heard echoes of gratitude that went far beyond a simple school visit. "Thank you for the invitation," he replied. "And for everything else." They walked together toward the school's exit, passing bulletin boards covered with children's artwork and displays celebrating military families. It was normal and domestic, yet Jake understood that it represented the culmination of decades of work that had kept promises made before he was born. "How many?" Jake asked as they reached the parking lot. 43 schools," Sarah Michelle replied. 1,700 military children, every one of them protected by resources their families will never know about. Jake thought about the scope of what she'd built: protection networks that spanned multiple services, intelligence capabilities that exceeded government resources, educational programs that prepared the next generation for challenges they would face. "Is this what you promised my mother?" he asked. Sarah Michelle stopped beside her car and looked at him with eyes that held depths he'd never fully understood. "I promised Rebecca that if anything happened to her, I would watch over her son and help him fulfill whatever purpose he was meant to serve. But what we've built goes beyond that promise." She gestured back toward the school where children were playing on equipment that incorporated security features designed to protect them from threats their parents face daily. "We've created something that ensures military children will be safer, military families will be protected, and military personnel will have the support they need to serve principles that matter. We've built a legacy that honors not just Rebecca's memory, but the memories of everyone who's given their lives in service to others." Jake understood that he was looking at the completion of something that had begun before his birth, had shaped his entire life, and would continue long after his own service had ended. The promise Sarah Michelle had made to his mother had grown into something unprecedented in American military history: a protection network that operated outside official structures while serving the same fundamental mission. "What happens next?" Jake asked. "Next, we hand it over to the people who carry it forward," Sarah Michelle replied. "Your team, the other units we've protected, the children who are growing up knowing they're valued and defended. The next generation understands threats and capabilities that previous generations never had to consider." Jake looked back at the school and realized that history would mark this as the moment when American military families moved from vulnerability to protection, when promises made in graveyards became institutions that would endure for generations. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Sarah Michelle smiled with the warmth he remembered from childhood, when she'd been just his mother's friend who visited occasionally and brought presents that made him feel special. "Jake," she said, "I've been watching over you for 36 years. Did you think I was going to stop now?" She got into her car and drove away, leaving Jake standing in the parking lot of an elementary school that represented the culmination of everything he'd worked toward since making a promise at his mother's grave. But as he watched her taillights disappear into Virginia Beach traffic, Jake realized that endings were really beginnings. The protection network Sarah Michelle had built would continue under new leadership. The children she taught would grow up to serve principles that had been defended by people whose names would never appear in history books, and somewhere, in ways that transcended normal understanding of life and death. Rebecca Sullivan's promise to her son had been kept while creating possibilities for protection and service that would endure long after everyone involved had passed into memory. 10 years later, the dedication ceremony for the Rebecca Sullivan Memorial Foundation took place. On a crisp autumn morning at Arlington National Cemetery, in a grove of trees that overlooked the Potomac River and the nation's capital, representatives from every branch of the military stood alongside congressional leaders, intelligence officials, and families whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work. Jake, now a retired Navy captain, stood beside the memorial stone that bore his mother's name and the inscription, "In honor of those who protect the protectors, and in memory of promises that transcend time itself." The foundation had become the public face of the protection network that Sarah Michelle had built, providing educational support, medical assistance, and security resources for military families, while maintaining the operational capabilities that had made their work possible. It represented the transformation of invisible assistance into institutional support that would endure regardless of the individuals who had created it. Speaker after speaker rose to describe the foundation's impact. Thousands of military children who'd received educational opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Hundreds of families who'd been protected from financial hardship during medical crises. Dozens of military units whose operational effectiveness had been preserved through support that addressed their personal concerns. But Jake's attention was focused on a figure standing at the edge of the gathering, partially obscured by the shadows of the memorial trees. Sarah Michelle appeared exactly as she had 10 years earlier, unchanged by time that seemed to have no power over her existence. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jake made his way toward her position. But when he reached the spot where she'd been standing, he found only a folded piece of paper placed beneath a small stone. Jake opened the paper and read words written in handwriting he recognized from childhood. Thank you notes his mother had helped him write. The promise has been kept. Jake, your mother would be proud of the man you've become and the legacy you've helped create. The protection will continue, the mission will endure, and the children who grow up safe because of what we built together will carry forward principles that make the world better. Some promises are larger than the people who make them. Some obligations transcend the normal boundaries of life and service. Some friendships create possibilities that echo across generations. Thank you for letting me keep my word to Rebecca. Thank you for helping me turn guilt into protection, loss into legacy, and promises into institutions that will outlast all of us. The work continues. The children are safe. The promise is kept. With love that endures beyond time itself, Sarah Michelle. Jake folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket, then looked around the cemetery at headstones that marked the lives of people who'd served principles larger than their own interests. His mother's name wasn't engraved on any of those stones, but her influence was visible in the foundation that would protect military families for generations to come. As Jake walked back toward his car, he passed groups of military children who were playing in the memorial grove while their parents attended the dedication ceremony. They were laughing, running, completely unaware of the resources and capabilities that protected them from threats their parents faced daily. But they were safe. They were valued. They were defended by promises that had been kept across decades. And beyond normal human limitations, Jake got into his car and drove toward home, where photographs on his mantle told the story of a life dedicated to service and the people who'd made that service possible. But as he drove through Arlington's tree-lined streets, he found himself thinking not about the past but about the future. Somewhere, in ways that exceeded conventional understanding, the protection continued, the mission endured, and the promise that had shaped his entire life lived on in institutions that would guard the next generation of military families. Rebecca Sullivan's son had kept his word, her best friend had kept hers, and together, they'd created something that would honor both their memories long after anyone remembered the names of the people who'd made it possible. Years passed, and Jake continued his work with the foundation, watching as new generations of military families grew up protected by the network Sarah Michelle had built. On quiet evenings, he would sometimes feel a familiar presence, a gentle reminder that promises kept in love never truly end. The protection continued, the mission endured. And in elementary schools across the country, children played safely while their parents served, never knowing that someone who had transcended death itself was still watching over them. Jake Sullivan had kept his promise to his mother. Sarah Michelle had kept hers to Rebecca. And together, they had created something that would protect the protectors for generations to come. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage, sacrifice, and promises that transcend time itself. Your support helps us bring you these powerful stories.